But I think if every European company who sources from China would support 2 factories to look into what is your biggest needs, what are your children's biggest needs, then we can create real change, and we would actually have a huge impact. So I definitely think there's a gigantic opportunity here.
All right, this is Heja Framtiden, a Swedish podcast on the future. I'm at Save the Children's office here in Stockholm, Rädda Barnen. And I'm sitting here with Ines Kämpfer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me and your interest in our work.
Executive Director at something called CCR in Hong Kong. It's a great name. Can you tell us what CCR is and why it was founded in the first place?
Sure. And a good job for actually managing to get all the C's in the right place. So CCR stands for the Center for Child Rights and Corporate Social Responsibility. And basically what we're doing is we're trying to work with businesses to understand what impact, in particular in their supply chains, they do have on children's rights, whether that's intended, unintended, direct, indirect impact, and then really working with the businesses together to see, can we ensure that this impact is a positive one rather than a negative one. So that really in a nutshell is what we're trying to do. So we're working directly with businesses, trying to find also kind of common ground where we see, okay, here business has a challenge, an issue. We also see that this creates an issue for child rights. How can we bring those two things together and actually create a positive story out of that?
So Save the Children is the founder and the owner of the company, right?
Yeah.
Of the organization.
Yes, absolutely. So Save the Children decided a few years back that they wanted to have within the NGO, that they wanted to have something more of a consulting services that allows them to work with companies on those issues. So if we go and we advise a company, for example, on child labor and supply chain, then that's not something that should happen under kind of charity umbrella, but this should happen more often a business-to-business exchange where Save the Children actually becomes a service provider. And so CCR within Save the Children is that consulting services. We see ourselves as a social enterprise, so it's obviously not for profit, but it is still based on a business relationship and how we work with companies.
And you received funding from the Swedish government initially?
Very initially, yes. We had some funding from the Swedish government to really set that up. And it's been now, I think, at least in the Asia side, I think it's now 3 years that we are working basically without any external funding, but directly with the funds that companies pay us for the services that we provide.
But is it still mainly a connection between Swedish companies and Asian workers?
Not actually. So Swedish companies obviously are a big part of the people that we work with, but I think particularly in terms of revenue, we work as much with American companies, British companies, that's probably the 3 biggest groups. Then some other European companies, like actually German companies we work a lot with as well. And slowly but surely we also start to work directly with Chinese and Hong Kong-based companies.
So what are the most common child-related issues that foreign companies can experience when working with these Asian companies?
So if we look at Asia supply chain, we identified in the last close to 10 years that we're working in those issues, we identified 3 big areas. Obviously, the area everybody thinks of when we start talking about that is child labor, which unfortunately still is an area. And I must say, when I started with this work soon 5 years ago, I was kind of thinking that's not going to be a big issue. But then realizing, that's probably something that's going to stick around for company as a potential risk for them, but obviously also then as a big risk for the children that are involved in it. The second big area that we see also partly related to that is that companies are potentially employers of children who are in working age. So, for example, in China, children are allowed to work by the time they reach the age of 16. So they're still children, but they are allowed to work and they have special protection that should cover their form of employment. And we do see a lot of issues here, both because companies tend to not officially hire them because of the protection that they would have to provide. So factories, for example, particularly the good ones, the better ones, let's say, are kind of hesitant to hire those young workers because they can only work maximum 8 hours a day. They shouldn't do overtime. They shouldn't do night shift. There's certain positions they cannot make. So they're kind of considered as a bit of an extra hassle to hire. And at the same time, where they find work, and that's throughout Asia, they find work then in lower tier supply chains, more informal settings, where they're totally unprotected, and does still become a part of the supply chains of international companies, but not on the visible level. So that's the second biggest issue. And then the third one, or issue, the challenge. And then the third one is actually that companies have an immense impact on children through the parents that they hire. So if I have a factory somewhere with 3,000 workers, or I have plantations with thousands of workers, the conditions I will give to the parent workers will have a direct, very real impact on the children. And so in China, for example, we have the issue of left behind children. So the children who do not move with their parents to go and work in coastal areas, but stay behind in their villages. And this creates a huge challenge for those kids and the workers themselves, as they never see their children. Many of them, in our last survey, I think it was still 70% of the working parents who only see their kids once or twice a year. And obviously that's creating a lot of social and psychological challenges for those families. And so that's areas that's nobody's fault. It's not like a company's fault to sources in China that this is the case. There's a lot of reasons, maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, but there's a lot of reasons why that situation is like that. The fact is that if we take this into account as a business, we might be able to create an immense positive impact for those kids through taking better care of the parent workers. So child labor, young workers under 18, and parent workers, the three big issues.
So yeah, we've been touching upon social sustainability a lot in the podcast, and with better transparency, it allows for better supply chain control, naturally, but it also puts an increasing amount of pressure on the consumer brands, on the brands here in Sweden and Europe. And I think the question is always interesting: how far is the responsibility? How far can it reach? What do you think?
So basically, I mean, on a very kind of simplistic level, I still feel that I have to stand that it's obviously difficult, and we can say, oh, we didn't contract those people down the supply chain, or we didn't know our cotton is coming from this area, or we didn't know where our cacao was produced, etc. So we have a lot of arguments to say why maybe companies are not fully responsible. The fact, though, is that we are sourcing from those countries because the prices there are cheap. And they are cheap partly because people live in poverty, partly because governments are not functioning the way they should, etc. And so we as consumers, as well as companies, benefit directly from sourcing from those countries. So even if it's not intended, if we don't, or even if it's a couple of steps down, it's still a fact that as companies and Western consumers, we are directly benefiting from the fact that we now can go and buy a T-shirt for under 10 euros in shops. And so I think with that comes a lot of responsibility, which we can't push off and just say, oh, we didn't know what's happening down the stream. This said, clearly, so there's different ways of how we can go about that. So it won't be possible for a Swedish, particularly medium-sized company to go and check out every household that might be somewhere involved in production of their products. But I think we can create business practices that create leverage, transparency, and through that cascading down that responsibility and that different value settings that we wanna push towards. And I think when we go in detail, there is ways for businesses to behave differently. So that we can at least kind of mitigate some of those negative circumstances that the people that produce those goods for us are kind of trapped in.
So, I mean, many NGOs, and I think many people see NGOs as, just working with aid money in some way. And is this an increasing approach to go after the corporate side?
I mean, I think it is it's not going to solve everything, right? You probably won't be able to do emergency relief just by saying, oh, you're producing there, so as a corporate you need to have all this money ready. But if we look at can we solve some of this livelihood problems of workers with more responsibility, I definitely think it's a very sustainable way to go about it. Sometimes it's, there's discussion, should we just get a corporate to donate $1 million for some project, or should the corporate think about or their supply chain and then change the conditions within their supply chain? From CCR/CSR perspective, we definitely lean towards those solutions because we find them more sustainable. We find them creating more independence amongst the people who produce or are involved in supply chains. It's a business transaction, and we're actually just appreciating more what they're doing, paying potentially better for their work, ensuring that that their work is happening under better conditions, which seems a longer term kind of way of going about it than just donating and basically handing out goods. So there's definitely, I think, a strong argument to do that. It's not going to replace a lot of the work that NGOs are doing entirely, and it's not going to replace the money that is needed through donations. But I think if we want to get to a world that's a little bit more equal and a little bit more fair, then I think this is a really good way to start working on it.
And we've seen this move towards the sort of the third leg in the sustainability triangle, more towards social sustainability. And if you look at Middle Eastern and Asian countries that have discovered that they can switch to renewable energy, for example, they are investing billions of dollars in that and can really make a huge impact. Do you think we can see the same impact when these countries also discover the benefits of social sustainability?
I think social sustainability is a bit more complicated because I think the kind of calculations on returns of investment are not so easily calculatable. Like, it's not like if you do a lot of the kind of sustainability environmental work, you can really put it down to numbers and you can say, okay, we make XYZ investment and that will pay off in 2 years and we'll get better. Unfortunately, with the sustainable investment, it's not quite as easy because it's sometimes a bit more hidden. It's hard to put it down into numbers. It's hard to calculate it. This said, we can see that in certain countries, at least, they do see that potentially that could be one of their advantages, although it is a very hard field for them. So we know that, for example, Sri Lanka has actually created quite a few areas with strong factories, with good conditions, etc. They do attract business as well, but they don't attract quite as much business as a low-cost country like recently. Maybe Myanmar has become more popular because wages are so low. So I think it is not yet the case that a company would stand out, or a country, would stand out and say, hey, look, if you come and produce in our country, conditions are much better, and then the companies would run there. Unfortunately, right now, we're still in a situation where the price, and that's in particular the wages, are a real drive for both investors who create or who build factories. Those investors are currently to a big part from China, who go and build the factories, and then the buyers who use those factories, the immediate cost or the short-term cost still seems to be very much in front of their calculations.
So even though you maybe can't say too much about human rights issues in China politically, you can maybe tell us a bit about how companies actually can make an impact in these circumstances.
Yeah. So we're really focusing, so we're not an advocacy group or within China, but we're really focusing with the companies on what they can do. And so we're seeing, there's a couple of big issues for Chinese workers in China today. And actually the family issue that I shortly described before is a really big one. For all the workers who have children, which is in most factories, that's ranging between 60 to 80% who are in this situation have children, where then again the majority doesn't manage to actually move with their children. There is some change there. in terms of what is happening in China. It's currently considered by the government as a big issue because there is a child protection issue. If you have a lot of children who only grow up with their grandparents, particularly if the grandparents are older, it might be hard for them to look after kids. There have been some horrible stories in the media about children who froze to death, suicide of children, etc. So this topic has taken a lot of attention within China as well. And actually the Chinese government does see it as a potential risk and is working towards and has changed some of the legal conditions for workers to make it easier to, for example, settle down in different places and bring their children with them, which so far is very, very difficult and still very difficult for places like in Shanghai and Beijing. So if you're not basically from that place, and then you cannot bring your kids and let them go to school in public school. You don't have the right to access to public schooling in those cities. But there's more and more second-tier cities where that law is changing. And now what that means, what we see for the companies, if we consider that as if like there's a Swedish company who sources in China and really thinks about that and really thinks about, well, we do have thousands of workers who make our products. So maybe one story I can tell to that, which was a story that for me was very eye-opening. It's a couple of years ago, actually, before I did this particular work. I was working in a toy factory in China, and I saw all these people doing those toys. And at that point, they were doing these kids' doctors set, where you have the little stethoscope and the little hammer for your knee. And the thing I think why I was so touched, because at that point, my kids had exactly that toy in their room. And so it was quite a shabby factory, honestly. The conditions were bad. And I saw all these workers doing that toy, and it just really got to me because my kids were using that particular toy. And so I sat down and talked to one of the workers. There was a woman probably around 30, 35. And so I asked her where she's from, and then I asked her if she has kids herself. And she said, yeah, I have 2 kids. One is 5, one is 7. So more or less also in the age where they would actually play with that toy. So then I said, so are you going to go home over Chinese New Year? She said, yes, I'm going to go home. I haven't seen them for a year, which already I find very touching. And I asked her, well, will you bring a toy to your kids? And like, are you allowed to bring one? And she probably even thought I tricked her. And she said, no, I would never steal anything. I would never steal anything. She was like terrified by that question. But then I thought, how unfair. There is a mother. She's sitting there every day, probably 12 hours a day on that line doing that toy. And nobody thinks of that she might like to bring that toy home to show to her kids. One, they would like the toy. Second, she did it. Right? So that would actually be a really nice thing for the kids also to understand what their mom's doing the whole year when she's gone. And it really, really got to me that we don't think of the workers as parents and as human beings. And as such, I was really happy then later to start working with CCR/CSR, where we have the chance to do that. And that's really, actually, I tell this story a lot to companies, because I want companies to think about that. I want them to think about who are the people who are doing that and what's their situation. And now we started working with companies. In the last 3 years, we've managed, together with the support from brands, in 44 companies, we were setting up child-friendly spaces in those factories, so that the kids could come and visit their parents over summer for 2 months. And this is for these families, it's often the very first time that they spend more than 10 days together, that they have a kind of family life where they go to work, the kid goes to basically daycare in the morning, they have dinner together, and they spend the weekend together. And the fascinating thing with that story is that if the brand support is a little bit, the factories and the management, they love it. They're really supportive of it. I've never seen another project where I've seen so much support from the factory management to do that. Because for them, it's a good retention strategy. The workers are happy. They're the good guys in the story. They're quite used to be the bad guys. So in this story, they're the good guys. And they like that. They like to be the good guys and find ways to do that. And so we really, and this is something companies can do, right? Like we have small companies, SMEs. They might have sourced from 5 factories in China. They do it in 1 or 2 of their factories. It doesn't cost them a huge amount of money, but they make a real impact. They actually bring families together. And so we have 44 factories. The majority of them keeps on doing it. Like we do it first time, then they keep on doing it. This year, as we speak, I think today we are in 3 different factories. Just today alone, where we're setting, helping the factory to prepare for summer to set the space up. So we'll have another, I think, 30 plus factories this year. So we'll just in 3 years we have 77 factories who set this up, or are going to set this up and continue doing that. That's really impacting thousands of families. And it's a fairly simple thing. It's not rocket science. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money. We do have some big companies who, invest in 15 factories every year now to do that. And then we do have the smaller ones who said, let's do it one a year. And like that, we are building kind of this positive impact that we're doing. So it's a very concrete example and how we really can change people's lives without getting too much into political issues or, getting too trapped in those difficult questions, but making real impact. So it's not just that we avoid those questions, but really trying to create a real impact here.
Can we say something about why helping poor children is making such a big impact in the world?
Well, obviously they are the future. And what we see, right, is what is happening in their lives will so dramatically define who are they going to be, the situations they're going to be in. We can actually very practically see, for example, in our work. So I said before, another topic that we're working on is child labor, and a lot of the kids that we deal with that are maybe 13, 14, who end up working in a factory, particularly in China. They're not normally ending up there because they're starving poor. China has developed immensely, so it's rare. We do have situations like that, but it's rare. Most of the kids end up there because their families broke apart. And that, again, is related to the migration of the parents, them not living home, so the kids have no relationship to their parents. They don't really feel at home in their villages with their grandmas who don't understand them anyways, etc. And so they somehow find their ways, they drop out of school. So, and we really see that those things are very connected. So if we manage to support kids, and here it's about family, right? It's one of the child rights that children should grow up in a family that protects them. And so it's trying to create that protection, because if we miss that, some kids will be fine. They will get out of it. But some kids won't, because that protection and that kind of security, also psychologically, that they needed was not there. And so it's really investing into that next generation. We can see if parents are more involved, no matter the education style, no matter if they're particularly good parents or bad parents, but if parents are more involved, kids are more likely to stay in school longer. If kids are more likely to stay in school longer, they'll do better, they'll have better jobs, etc. So there's really so many things here linking. And it's actually interesting when companies who have child labor in their factories come to us and say, oh, what can we do as prevention? But there's nothing, or they say there's nothing we can do because we can't change the education system in China. So no, you can't change the education system in China, but what you can do is support the kids of the workers that you employ or that your factories employ, because then if you do that, you will reduce the risk for those kids. And if everybody does that, right? I'm talking about 77 factories. But I think if every European company who sources from China would support 2 factories to look into what is your biggest needs, what are your children's biggest needs, then we can create real change, and we would actually have a huge impact. So I definitely think there's a gigantic opportunity here, without doing tons of charity and spending tons of money to create a positive impact in those countries.
And so if I run a fashion company or a toy company or an electronics company, I can get in touch with you and set up some kind of program?
Absolutely. So I don't want to do too much business development here, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, if normally companies come to us and say, look, maybe they have a challenge, maybe they don't know. They say, we do have a few factories in China. We actually don't know what's going on in those factories. The majority of European companies, in particular, who source from Asia, not only from China, do so through some importers or agents or however they call them. They might sit in Hong Kong. There might be even European importers who in turn have their factories and their network. So a lot of times, even that first level, even the assembly level where your T-shirt is being kind of printed or something like that is not known to particularly the SMEs. Bigger companies have a bit more transparency, but many don't actually really know or have visited the companies, and so they say, well, we don't know. Others come to us and say, well, we actually know we saw this is an issue, and what can we do about it? And so we look into what is most suitable for the specific context, whether that's a factory. We also work quite a bit currently in agriculture or food supply chains, etc. So we look at those different challenges. We just did a study on homework, which is something that happens a lot in kind of accessories and kind of home goods, like decorative goods. So many of those goods are not actually happening in factories. They're being done by workers in their homes, and thus have a lot of potential impact on children, because the production is happening in the kids' home directly. The companies buying from Europe might not know that, because they have a collection center which kind of looks like a factory, but it's not actually coming from there. So we look at with the companies, what is the challenge. And I think, interestingly, as we also want to talk about positive stories here, recently we have more and more of those smaller SMEs, importers. They're not a brand. Nobody knows those companies. But because their customers are more and more expecting, they really start to see it for them as a business advantage. So we have these small German, Swedish companies who come to us and say, we source from 15 factories in China. We have maybe 5-10 different or even more different clients in Europe. How can we stand out as a importer that does more than the general public? So I think that's quite refreshing to see, because it's something very new. Because I think for a long time this kind of CSR and sustainability, social sustainability work was just sticking to the brands, the Nikes and H&Ms and etc. And another trend that I find very, very positive is actually just last week I got an email from I think it's Hong Kong-based, Chinese-owned factory, who were telling me, well, we're going to open a factory in Myanmar. And we heard from one of our buyers that there is a big risk around child labor, juvenile worker, etc., potentially in Myanmar. So could we sit together with you and think about what we need to do when starting operation there in order to make sure we protect children and young people? And I honestly was blown away, because we're not used to that, right? Normally we come in and it's the Chinese companies or the factories that we need to tell them, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that. And seeing that shift in them taking responsibility themselves, and before they even start operation, thinking about those questions. I mean, I was like, this is just like, that email definitely made my day, because that's really, I think, where we want to get to with this kind of work.
Can companies also ask you for good factories?
We don't certify factories normally. So we're not a business, I wouldn't go and say, oh, so source from those free. What we would tell companies is like, these are the questions you can ask your factories. And depending on how they answer these questions, you might be able to tell, what kind of factory is that? Do I want to source from that factory? But we ourselves do not make recommendations, or we don't make certifications, because that's a whole other business. And in my experience, not necessarily always the best way to go about it, because if you make certifications, etc., it's often you lose kind of the main focus of those projects, because it becomes like in terms of policies and who's got what papers, etc. But what we definitely think, and we often or support companies with, is asking the right questions when they source, and particularly when they pick companies. And I think that's also a big area where we still have a lot of room for improvement, is how companies pick their suppliers and how they decide, do I produce in factory A and B? Right now, it's if quality and price and speed are good, then they would have some zero tolerance areas where they say, okay, if that's bad, or if you see some kids, then we're not gonna source there. But it's often still quite simple how they make those decisions. And I think we try to work a lot with companies to develop more long-term thinking, and really also look at it from a risk perspective. And another interesting trend is that financial institutions particularly here in the Nordic area, are really, really interested in that. And they start to ask similar questions now when they decide whether they want to make investments in certain companies. And I think that's a very positive trend, because obviously money decides a lot of things. And if they say, look, we're not going to support that investment because we think there's too many unanswered questions, or we have too little transparency into those issues, it's not necessarily that that's all bad, but we just don't know. Then I think they can really change the behavior of and change sourcing and investing decisions.
And your background is from academia. You have a PhD in sociology of religion. It sounds so interesting.
Yeah, funny. But it actually all came together very well. But I mean, sociology of religion basically looks at kind of the impact religion has on society. And I just kind of fell into that. I was studying social work and sociology. I was also studying a science of religion, and then I kind of came into that area. I think so. I had a PhD that was around understanding the impact of Asian value settings on human rights perspectives, and so in that sense, I think it did prepare me quite well on what I'm doing now, but also because in terms of methodology and the way we work in CCR/CSR is really very much data based. So I think one of the maybe specialities that we have is that we, for one, go about it in quite scientific ways to understand workers' needs. So we do representative worker surveys. We don't just talk to a few people or just a quick audit to understand what the issues are. But both quantitative and qualitative methodology is really important. And then working with businesses together to really measure the impact, both the impact it has on children, it has on workers, but also the impact it has on the actual business. So, for example, we measure retention, so it's like how long workers are staying at a factory, how big the turnover is for this factory, potential productivity issues. So we bring a lot of those data things together. So I think that background in academia with very very statistics, data focused, but also having a strong focus on this kind of understanding of cultures and impacts on human rights perspective was really helpful. Not something I could have planned, to be honest, or anyone could have planned. I think this came together very well.
It usually does. And you're from Switzerland, but you only speak 5 languages.
Only, yeah. I should speak some more.
You don't speak Swedish.
I don't speak Swedish, exactly. So my big miss in my language. Yeah.
What is your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
I think if everyone, whatever job we're doing, wherever we are, if we just trying to make a difference, it's easier to answer the other way around. So if you don't want to change the world, right, we just say, oh, there's nothing we can do. This is just how the world works, and we just accept it. And if we want to change the world, that we just turn around and say, no, I don't want to accept it. It can be different. And if we get, and I actually think I see people in companies single-handedly turning their companies around. Which I think is amazing, right? It's easy. I mean, this is my job, so it's easy for me because that's what I'm supposed to do, to go to companies and get them to think about those questions. But if I see one company, one sourcing person at a company who nobody asked them to do that, it's not their own KPI. They're not going to get a raise at the end of the day, but they're just saying, no, I'm going to turn around how this works because I don't like it. And so I see people making real differences like that. And so I think that's how we go about it.
And why is CCR/CSR part of this future in a way? Why do you think what you're doing is special?
I think well, for one, we really work with business, but also I think we're very, very impact oriented. There's a lot of BS in this industry, a lot of nice words, a lot of like sustainability, future, cooperation, blah blah blah, collaboration. So a lot of those things, and I think one of the things you don't get with CCR/CSR is many of those big words, but really actually the question of like, what was our impact? We just started last year to send Christmas cards to our clients or partners. But we only sent the Christmas cards to those clients where we could really pin down, this is what we achieved together. And we said, okay, 200 families spent the summer together because of what we did. They wouldn't have spent the summer together otherwise. Or 10 kids who were found in a factory are now back in school. So we're really trying to cut through the big words and to cut through a lot of the PR that is in this whole CSR industry and really pin it down to what are we actually doing and never lose that out of our of our sight. We wanted to have business impact. We wanted to be positive for business, but we need to have real impact. It cannot be just some glossy sustainability report. And that's the frustrating things, right? If I go to a conference, I'm always frustrated because in a conference, a CSR conference anywhere, it sounds like we're great. Like all companies are doing amazing. It's all beautiful. And obviously we know it's not quite like that. So I think where we do stand out, and I think that's also this connection to Save the Children and our strong focus on children's rights that helps us with that, is that we're not going to let companies get away with just glossy language. It's really like, so did you have any impact? And is that impact positive for kids? And that's our question.
Do you have a reading tip?
Yeah, so I was just we were thinking about that, and generally it's very hard for me to find time to read. And normally when I do read, like books, like more than just reading for work or reading another report for work, etc. I tend to read crime stories of the countries that I travel to or the countries we're working with. So lately I've actually been looking at those or reading stories. They're called the Doctor series, and they're kind of crime stories that are happening in Laos. And I do that in other places as well. So I do that because it kind of is an easy read. It's a crime story. It's fun. It takes my mind off some of the tougher things of the world, but at the same time often gives a really good insight in some of the history and culture, etc. And so, for example, those Laos crimes are really interesting because one learns a lot about the Buddhist beliefs in Laos and kind of the belief in spirits, etc. So it's a bit space for a Western Swiss mind, but really, really interesting and helpful.
Great. That's a good tip, actually. Who do you think I should interview in the podcast?
Well, ideally, I think generally I would like that we have much more voices of kids, for example. So maybe one day you could come to one of the countries we work in and have a chat with some of the young workers in factories, for example, and hear their stories. I generally think, right, we should give much more voices to those people that we don't talk about too much otherwise. And talking, for example, to the people who make our T-shirts and toys, cups, etc.
Yeah, that's a good thought, actually. Let's hope they have a nice, positive vision on the future. After you've been working with the factory,
I think we've really seen that. So maybe the kids I've just been thinking about when I said that, where we last year started a pilot, which is continuing now with IKEA in Vietnam, where where they're giving opportunity to young workers, 16, 17, to work in some of their best factories. It's not IKEA's factories, but it's their suppliers, and really are getting this protected environment. It's more a bit like an apprenticeship, really getting a chance to learn different skills, but also to make a salary, to make their living. And what was really fascinating, and I think it would be great to talk to those kids more, is that often when I otherwise meet kids in factory settings, they have no opinion on anything. They don't complain. They don't seem to have thought or being ever given the chance very much to think about what they feel, what they think about it, what their opinion is. And one of the most fascinating things in that program, that after 6 months of those kids in that program, these kids had opinion. They even complained about certain things and they praised other things, but I find that change between just, well, whatever's going to happen in my life's going to happen, I don't have a lot to say anyways, to know this I like and this I don't like, and that's how I want it to be, and I'm not accepting if that's different. So I think we really can make a difference if we give people a chance to believe in their future and to give them the faith that they can actually change and impact their future.
Brilliant last words. Thank you so much, Ines Kämpfer, Executive Director at CCR in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, and thank everybody for the patience to listen. Thanks.
Thank you, Save the Children, for inviting me to their offices in Bromma. Everything you need to know can be found on hejaframtiden.se. My name is Christian von Essen. Follow us on social media, and thank you for listening.